Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So this presentation, really series of presentations, is on Chapter 9, and Chapter 9 deals with three different yet related issues. Excuse me. One is mass media, two is elections, and three is campaigns. And so we're going to finish on media today and begin to talk about elections. We probably won't finish that today. I'm not quite sure which slide I left off on, but I wanted to point out that we have a somewhat contradictory feature in the mass media, because on the one hand, we have increasing, and I'll show you this in a minute, increasing corporate own concentration of mass media, including fewer and fewer news-gathering organizations, but we also, in large part because of cable and the internet, have many more media types, as well as social media, than we did previously. So I think one of the critical points here is that media are not neutral actors that simply provide information. They are so prominent in American political life that they are now political actors themselves. And in a current campaign, for example, Mitch McConnell is using commentary by someone at one of the people who regularly appears, Chuck Todd, on MSNBC, to attack his opponent in the Senate election in Kentucky. Since major corporations own most of the mainstream media, one of the things they're interested in is making profits. And the question is, how do you do that? And the main answer is provide entertainment and sell advertising. And so that's what the mass media is largely about. It does report news, but it also misinforms, either by omission or commission, that is to say, probably more by omission than commission in most cases. Simply put, if one doesn't do reasonably comprehensive and exhaustive reporting on a topic or an issue or an event, it's unlikely that those who are the recipients of that information will not have a full picture. Not having a full picture is, in my judgment, a form of misinformation. The media does have a role in selecting public issues and problems and covering them. They tend to socialize us to the dominant political culture, because the media looks primarily at the major governmental institutions and national political activities. The mass media also provides a political forum, often for government officials and parties and candidates, and can on occasion act as a government watchdog. Usually this function is not all that effective. Excuse me. The media's power in some measure comes from both agenda setting and framing, and very simply, what this means, what agenda setting means, is that the mass media is able to bring to the public's attention certain issues and problems, but not others. And so there's a judgment that's being made there about what is most important to communicate to the American people. Not everything can be covered all the time. In fact, not everything can be covered any time, because there's just too much out there. And the medium itself doesn't lend itself to a full and comprehensive presentation of any single issue. Secondly, the media frames issues or problems. And this is another way of saying that the mass media help us interpret, and sometimes can affect the ways we interpret political affairs. TV news in fact, reaches more people than any other news source, but its depth of coverage is minimal. A 30-minute TV news show, I know this may sound unbelievable to you, but a 30-minute TV news show, in fact, is little more in terms of content than the headlines on a front page of a newspaper and one column of information, of one column of one article. That's what it is. Yes, there are a lot of pictures. There aren't so many words. So the information that TV news provides tends to be more visual, which can have an impact. It tends to be superficial because there's not enough words in there to explain very much. To be concerned about personality and sound bites or horse races in political campaigns. I may have mentioned this in an earlier morning, but I think that one of the prime examples of the need to cover campaigns with a horse race point of view was nowhere clearer than in 2008 when Hillary Clinton was running in the primaries against Barack Obama. Barack Obama won 13 primaries in a row. I'm not saying that's good, bad, or in between. What I'm saying is when somebody beats one candidate beats another candidate 13 times in a row in presidential primaries in 13 different states, there's no way that the candidate that's been beaten is competitive at that point. There's no way that candidate can win the nomination, but it's important for the media to keep things interesting, and the horse race dimension of political campaigns does that for them. So, just to give you a sense of the corporate concentration in the mass media, Clear Channel Communications owns 850 radio stations across the nation. TV and cable ownership is controlled by about 6 major companies. Comcast, which parenthetically is the most hated company in the country, Disney, Viacom, CBS, News Corp, and Time Warner. So probably each of you has some experience, in fact, with those media conglomerates. And this is a chart that shows the decline in the number of corporations that control a majority of U.S. media over a 20-year period. It's been a dramatic decline, not a slow decline. It's been a 90% decline over just 2 decades. You guys haven't even lived 2 decades yet, but it's gone from 50 to 5 in terms of control of the majority of the mainstream media. So the news is more and more nationalized, and national news gathering organizations became important in 20th century America, and this news gathering function, these organizations helped nationalize to some degree American political life. And today there's not too much variation in national news and events reporting across the nation. And one of the reasons why is that these large media organizations, which I named a moment ago, control most of the local newspapers and are affiliated with and have as affiliates the local TV stations. And so the number of organizations that in fact are news gathering, go out and find out what's going on, has been dramatically reduced. AP, Reuters, New York Times, and Washington Post are now the dominant news gatherers that, at least in the mainstream media, that most news outlets rely on. But we do have some new media. We have talk radio. We have a declining number of newspapers. And when they don't go out of business, they either have an internet presence, or the physical paper shrinks dramatically. But we also have an internet, which we didn't have before, which provides greater variety, depth, timeliness, and context, especially through social media and blogs. We have a democratization of access to new media, primarily through the internet, that allows people who never had an opportunity to, or the resources to participate, excuse me, in the political process to do so. My favorite story about this, you probably think that you don't have a whole lot of say or power in political life. Probably most of you can't even vote yet. But I want to tell you a story that suggests to me the power that new media can have. I think in 2006, if I'm not mistaken, it was before the 2008 election, so I think it was 2006. There was a candidate running for Senate in the state of Virginia. And there was a Republican and a Democrat, and they were running against one another. I'm blanking on his name right now, but it'll come to me. And in any case, one of the candidates had a staffer, a young man, 20 years old, who was a student at the University of Virginia. He was an unpaid staffer, and his job was to go around to the opponent's events, his speeches, and to videotape and to video them. And the candidate who he was videoing was 20 points ahead in the polls, and not only was going to win, certainly, but in fact was considered a front-running a candidate for president on the Republican ticket in 2008. George Allen, Senator Allen was his name. He was running for re-election. This is the guy who was videoed. So this young man, unpaid intern, 20 years old, never participated in politics in his life. He was a son of Indian, not Native American, but Indian parents, but he was an American citizen. So he went to Southwest Virginia to cover an event that Senator Allen was involved in, and he was speaking. And suffice it to say that the senator said some things that could reasonably be understood as racist and demeaning and homophobic. And in fact, he singled out the young man who was doing the videoing, in large part, I think, because of his color, and suggested very strongly that he really wasn't even an American, even though he, in fact, was and is. So this video went viral. In 24 hours, it was on mainstream TV. In 48 hours, it was on the front page of the Washington Post, and which, of course, is a major newspaper in Virginia. And George Allen lost the election. He then had, after the video became public and there was commentary on it, he had to respond, and his responses made his situation even worse because he lied about it. And that also was clear to the public. He ended up losing the election. He ended up not being a candidate for president. And this one young man, 20 years old, unpaid intern with a video cam, single-handedly destroyed this guy's candidacy. Actually, the guy destroyed it himself. It's just that it had to be made public. And so don't for a moment think that you are powerless. The new media does provide opportunities for people who just are normal citizens, just like this young man was, to make a difference in American politics. The internet does offer more diversity and deeper, in some ways, cultural penetration than mainstream media. You're running around with your phone and you can access the media, 24/7 now. And the textbook, I think, correctly suggests that the adversarial media has become increasingly partisan, and that includes media, new media. But one explanation is not just that it's more partisan, but that we've seen a tremendous proliferation of media outlets: cable, talk radio, websites, blogs, social media, that reflect a broader diversity of views than traditional media, and because the traditional media is less diverse than the American people as a whole. Comments or questions before I go on to talk about elections? Okay. Are any of you old enough to vote this time? Anyone voting? No? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's a serious responsibility. And I want to talk about elections, and there's some really good, important, basic stuff in this presentation on elections. This by no means is a fully comprehensive presentation of elections. If you want to look at elections, over the course of your lifetime, the single best website is Nate Silver's 538.com. He is very good, but there are many others as well. So I want to start with an observation, which is an observation that I make quite frequently, which is that the conventional wisdom about most things in life, including American political life, most of that conventional wisdom is incorrect. So if you ask the American people, one of the things they're going to say is, there's a problem in Washington. And the problem is Washington. That's the conventional wisdom. I beg to differ. There is a problem in Washington. The source of the problem is not Washington. Questions for you. Who makes and implements most election laws, regulations, processes, and technologies? Answer? What's the answer?
Congress?
State and local governments. Who elects the 535 members of Congress? Voters in individual states and in individual congressional districts. Who creates 100% of all the congressional districts for 435 members of the House of Representatives? State legislatures and governors in each state. If the American people don't like the way Washington is working, there's only two people in all of Washington, D.C. who have been elected nationally. And that's the president and the vice president. All the members of Congress are there because people in states, and individual states, and individual congressional districts, and individual governors and state legislatures have put them there. It's not Washington. Washington didn't put them there. The people in the states and House districts put them there. So this is Pogo, who's been around for some decades. We've met the enemy and he is us. It's not, don't try to pawn this off on Washington. We're the people who are either by voting or not voting, either by participating or not participating, are sending every single member of Congress to Washington. And research indicates clearly that from year to year, we choose to send at least 90% of the incumbents who stand for re-election back to Washington. We can vote. There's almost always more than one person to vote for. So the idea that somehow there's this awful, terrible, evil thing in Washington, and we're just here back in the states and local governments, and all we know the problems, and Washington's just a big bureaucracy, and they don't know the problems, and so forth, it's just not so. Not only is it not so, but if you look at the past 50 years, in terms of the number of people working in government, there's no change, no significant change whatsoever in the number of federal government employees, but substantial increases in the number of state and local government employees. So if you want to look at where people are employed in government, it's the increases in the past in the past 40, 50 years have been in state and local government, not the federal government. Comments or questions so far? You know, one of the things in life that it seems to be pretty commonplace is that it's often easier to blame somebody else than look at one's own responsibility for what happens, and that's part of the, I guess, the lesson from what I just described. There are many aspects of electoral politics in the United States that are important. I want to mention a few. One is geography and population. Geography means east, west, north, south. Geography means state boundaries and states as important political actors. It also means that House or congressional districts within states are important geographical entities. Rules. The rules for American elections are almost exclusively, not totally, but almost exclusively made by state and local governments and agencies. Governors, legislatures, state secretaries of state, county boards of elections, and so on. So again, this isn't and political parties. This is not Washington saying how to run elections. This is state and local governments being the primary determinants, and political parties, of how elections are run. Thirdly, one of the things that's changed over time is that the national political parties, both in Congress and the Democratic and Republican national committees, often play a more important role in trying to recruit and identify candidates to run for office. One of the reasons is because running for office costs so much money. And not the only reason, but that's one important reason. And obviously, it's different, the amount of money that's required to run for office, say for a House seat or for U.S. Senate, is going to be very different in California than it is in Rhode Island. Why? Simply because California is a much larger state and has a much larger population. Political campaigns are an important part of electoral politics. The single most important, and I'm going to talk about those probably next time, the single most important thing about politics and about electoral politics is voter turnout. Who votes? Who's registered and who votes? These two questions are the single most important determinants of who's going to win elections. Not always, but almost always. So one of the things that electoral politics involves is math. Okay? Numbers, counting votes. And in elections, the person with the most votes, depending on the rules, wins. Sometimes, depending on the election, in some elections, if you don't have a majority, then you have to have a second election. But that depends on the rules in each state that the state legislature and governor have enacted. But turnout, if you know nothing else about elections, understand that who votes, who is registered, and who votes, and how many, and the size of the turnout are what determine almost always who wins the election. And one other thing about money is just because a candidate has more money than another candidate, than an opposing candidate, it doesn't mean that the person with more money always wins. There are some very bad candidates with lots of money. Money helps, no question. If you have no money, it's very hard to win. But it is not the case that the person with the most money always wins. So why even have elections? They serve a number of purposes. First of all, voters can use elections to select their leaders and hold the government accountable. If you don't like what the government's doing, or you don't like what various elected officials have done, you can vote them out. Elections also structure political participation. We know when elections are going to be. We know what time of the year they're going to be. We know who the various candidates are, or at least we can know. And political campaigns and elections involve a lot of people participating in politics. One presidential election year, fortunately it was only one, I actually was responsible for managing 75 people on election day in, I don't know, I think 6 different precincts to try to see that our voters were voting. Another very important purpose of elections is to provide continuity in governance. There may not be continuity in policy, but continuity in governance means that if people agree, if everybody agrees that elections is how we select our leaders, then we can do this without resorting to violence. Elections are a peaceful way to transition from one leadership to different leadership. And I mean, this is the issue of transitions in leadership is a common problem in all nation states in the world. Okay? And the reason why is because political leaders die. They can't live forever. Their memory may live for a long time, but they can't live forever. And so someday, in every country on the planet, a political leader is going to die. Someday, a political leader is going to get too old to govern or to run for office. Someday, a political leader will decide not to run for re-election. And elections offer a vehicle for change in leadership without violence. And thus, generally speaking, elections can serve to legitimize a new government and an existing government, okay? The leadership is legitimate because it was freely elected. Elections can also reaffirm the rule of those in power, and yet at the same time can provide a safety valve, a way for people who disagree with the leadership to participate in a civilized and relatively peaceful way. So, American politics makes frequent use of elections. We select representatives. By the way, we select our members of Congress. We also, of course, select city council members. We select commissioners in county government or in township government. We vote for governor and various state offices and state legislative positions as well. So we can vote on a number of offices, local, state, and federal. We can participate in nominating party candidates for office, and through things like a referendum or an initiative, which are often at local and state but never at a national level, we can in fact make policy. Or through a referendum, we can even throw out a law that was passed by a state legislature. One of the things that American government textbooks tend to underplay, in my view, is the following, and this is very important. While it may be the case that voters ultimately control who governs them, assuming they vote, governments have considerable influence over when, where, and how citizens participate in voting and in elections, or whether they're even allowed to. And four of those vehicles are below. There are others as well. The census. Why is the census important? It is for a number of reasons. In terms of elections, it's important because since 1964 and the Westbury versus Sanders case and the Baker versus Carr decision by the Supreme Court, congressional districts have to have roughly the same population. I think it's, 700 and some odd thousand. So you can't have a House district which is, one has 250,000 people, another one has 1 million. Baker versus Carr is the quote-unquote one man, one vote decision, so that the census determines where people are, how many people there are, and then every 10 years, based on the census and based on an allocation of congressional districts, House districts, based on the census, state legislatures and governors end up, some of them, every 10 years, sometimes even more than that, redrawing congressional district boundary lines, which then are used to elect members of the House of Representatives. Most states are political parties. If there's a dominant political party, they will try to gerrymander congressional districts. We've already talked about this in previous classes, to increase the likelihood that the dominant political party in the state at that time will be able to elect more than their fair share of members of the House of Representatives. There are also state and local election officials and agencies that are important. The single most important state official regarding the regulation of elections is the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State in national politics deals primarily with foreign policy and diplomacy. The Secretaries of State in the 50 states are the chief election officials in those states. And all states as well have local election agencies. In Ohio, for example, it's a Board of Elections. And the way the Board of Elections are usually constructed is an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. And so they, in fact, shape how at the local level elections are conducted. So what I'm trying to tell you is this, and textbooks I think underplay this. They don't emphasize it enough. The Constitution, government bodies, political parties shape election rules, processes, and regulations. And because they do that, they shape election outcomes. And if you think I'm wrong, ask yourself, why do the political parties and their representatives in the various states fight constantly about what election rules ought to be? The answer is simple. If turnout determines who wins, each party tries to shape election laws and rules and regulations in a way that helps them win elections. Remember back to our discussion of political parties. What's the first purpose of a political party in the United States? To win election. How do you win an election? You get your people making election laws that favor you. I am sorry if this offends somebody. Elections are not neutral from one state to another. They're not done the same from one state to another. Election laws and regulations are not the same from one state to another. And so, and this is largely a function of custom and of party efforts within the states to shape laws that will affect turnout, which will determine who wins elections. And in each of the states, some more than others, there are a lot of obstacles that keep people away from the polls. The most obvious is an example of custom, which is, normally we have elections. In fact, I think the Constitution provides this, and certainly custom does, on the first Tuesday of November, and every 4 years for presidents, and again the first Tuesday in November for off-year elections. We'll talk more about these later on. In many European countries, they have election holidays, and you have an entire weekend to vote. And this, all other things equal, can increase voter turnout. We haven't made it that far yet. So, what about elections on the ground? What can you give me specific examples? Why does this matter? Why does what's going on at the street level in terms of voting booths and so forth, and voting technology and so forth? Why does this all matter? First of all, ballot design matters. George W. Bush got elected President of the United States in 2000 because of the ballot design in one county in the state of Florida. State and county laws actually shape the implementation of the electoral process. Key to these are boards of elections. Now, there is, for example, such a thing, and since I've been involved at the grassroots level on election days, I know firsthand that all precincts' resources are not the same. So if you go to, in a recent election in Ohio, for example, it's perfectly common for, say, university area or college area precincts to be swamped, and students have to stand in line for many, many, many hours in order to vote. Same thing in black districts, in black precincts. You go to white suburban areas, and there's plenty of voting booths, and there aren't long lines, and people are moving swiftly through the process. This isn't the case everywhere, but the point I'm trying to make very simply is that local boards of elections have limited resources. They have party preferences. Members are even on boards of elections because they represent one or the other political party. And so the allocation of voting booths, which one would just think, well, everybody gets the same, number. Well, not at all. Not at all. Voting technology and counting, how voting is done. Technologies are important in voting. You can do hand ballots, you can do scanning, you can do all kinds of things in terms of what kind of ballot you've got and where the information goes and how are votes counted and who's counting them. And sometimes some very kind of questionable things can go on in terms of the voting technology and whether it's adequate and who's counting and so forth. There are also differences from one state to another in terms of voting laws. How do you vote? Well, some states you can vote by mail. States have different registration and residency regulations. So if you're in Indiana and live in Indiana and you move to Ohio and you haven't lived there long enough to meet the residency requirement, you can't vote in Ohio. And that's the same in any other state. And then states have early and absentee voting. So the voting laws can be different. The regulations, the registration opportunities, all these things can be different. And this, of course, affects turnout. So, is voter turnout declining? Well, generally no, but we can see that there are differences between the number of people who vote and the number of people who are eligible to vote. Not everybody is registered. There are a number of demographic factors that sometimes in some elections influence who votes. Age, education, income level, minority status, and ideology. Older people, all other things equal, older people are more likely to vote than younger people. All other things equal, better educated people are more likely to vote than people with lower education. All other things equal, people with higher income are more likely to vote than those who have lower income, much lower income. People who are ideological, who have a strong party affiliation, are more likely to vote than those people who don't. Minority status used to be that whites voted more than blacks. Now it's about even. One of the reasons that blacks tended to vote less is because they were denied the right to vote in many states through Jim Crow laws, I think we talked about these in the past, the grandfather clause, the white primary, literacy tests, poll taxes, and so forth. There still are legal restrictions on voting, such as property requirements. Non-citizens generally can't vote. Convicted felons and current inmates in many states can't vote. The mentally incompetent can't vote, normally, if they've been certified in that regard, and people under 18 can't vote. There are various eligibility requirements, things like you've got to register. You're not automatically registered. You have to register. And you have to be a citizen. You have to be of a certain age. You have to meet the residency requirements. Some states have voter registration drives that make it easier to vote. We'll see next time that this can in fact change. One of the most important recent actions by the Supreme Court held a section of the Voting Rights Act, which was passed initially in 1965, which was responsible for finally giving African Americans the right to vote. Their ruling this year has been a green light, as we'll see next time, for states to make it harder for citizens to vote. We're out of time, and so next time we will pick up with slide 22. Any comments or questions? Okay, we'll see you next time. See you tomorrow morning.